Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in our semester end project review for Sweden in Finance 4550, the International Finance class. My name is Austin Dimick. I'm joined here by Tyler Atwan, TJ Clarkson, Jack Hoffbauer, and Nick Jackson. A little bit of a table of contents overview. We're going to talk about the Swedish GDP, currency, banking system, some of the major economic information and companies, and then kind of go over kind of where they stand geopolitically in the world. So to start off, we've got their GDP and primary indicators. So Sweden's GDP in 2021 was worth 627.44 billion US dollars, with 2022 projections nearing 640 billion US dollars. Compared to the US, the United States' GDP is 23 trillion US dollars, so a bit smaller. Swedish GDP saw a growth rate of 4.8% in 2021, compared to Sweden's 2020 GDP growth rate of negative 2.9%. That really being attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic that really kicked off in that year. Most recent GDP per capita data reflects 60,101.7 per person, compared to the United States' $69,287.54 per person. And then Sweden's debt to GDP is 39.6% compared to the United States' 137.2%. Moving on to the Swedish krona, which is the country's currency. It is a floating currency, and the SEK, as it's referred to, was introduced in 1873. And while Sweden joined the EU, the European Union, in 1995, the Swedish voters chose to reject the adoption of the euro in 2003. This was in order to maintain control of their own monetary policy. Currently, there is an initiative to push to the e-krona, which is a central bank issued digital currency that will be kind of indoctrinated in the coming years. Currently, the US dollar to SEK exchange rate is 10.4 SEK to $1 US, and is considered a relatively stable currency and has strengthened by 2.2% since August 31st of 2022. The Riksbank has been determined to maintain a constant annual inflation rate of 2% since 1992. Given the global economic conditions right now, they've been unable to maintain that, as their current inflation rate is 10.8%. So as I mentioned in the last slide, the Swedish banking and the Riksbank, the Central Bank of Sweden is known as the Riksbank. It was founded in 1668 when the Swedish Parliament decided to establish a central bank, and is the world's oldest and longest lasting central bank. The current account balance for Sweden is 42.8 billion SEK, which is approximately 4.1 billion US dollars. The current rate on 10-year bonds is 1.902%, and those bonds are rated AAA by Moody's and AAA by Standard & Poor's. Moving on to our demographic information, in 2021, Sweden had a population of 10,415,811 people. The national 2021 unemployment rate sits at 6.5%, a poverty rate of 15.7%, life expectancy of 82 years, a corporate tax rate of 20.6%, and a personal tax rate of 52.9%. Now I'll pass the baton to Nick, who will give us more in-depth synopsis on the country's history and economic activity.
Thanks, Austin. So yeah, we wanted to just briefly touch on Sweden's history. So Sweden was first populated between 8,000 and 6,000 BC by hunter-gatherers, although some anthropologists argue even earlier. The Sami are Sweden's indigenous people who have continued to live there throughout the ages. The first major development started with the Vikings, which happened between 800 and 1050 AD. And that's where Sweden and the surrounding area really saw a significant expansion of activity. And the Vikings explored much of the known world, conquering a lot of different places as well. And most importantly, the Vikings established trade routes with the Byzantine Empire and Arab kingdoms, many of which are still in existence today. So in Sweden's imports and exports are significantly impacted by those trade routes established at that time. Sweden's empire, as we kind of know it today, was founded in 1523 AD during the reign of Gustav Vasa. And since then, over the years, Sweden's become more industrialized, implementing more modern ways to govern their country, as we'll talk about. So with Sweden's government and rankings, their government is a constitutional monarchy. They have a king who rules over the country as a non-political head of state, meaning he has no political affinity and no formal powers. This is pretty similar to the king or queen of England. Rather, the king is a unifying symbol for the country. Sweden is also considered a parliamentary democracy where general elections are held every 4 years to determine who will hold office within the parliament. The party with the most votes appoints a prime minister who then forms the government. Swedish constitution determines how the country should be governed, and their constitution regulates decision-making, executive power, while also guaranteeing the freedoms and rights of Swedish citizens. The 349-member Swedish parliament forms policies and laws on behalf of the people who elect them. Sweden also joined the European Union in 1995, promoting diplomacy, freedom, and rule of law. The Index of Economic Freedom ranks countries based on their rule of law, government size, regulatory efficiency, and open markets. These calculations used to determine each country's ranking in the index show the overall freedom of each nation. Sweden ranks number 12 overall in the Index of Economic Freedom. The Corruption Perceptions Index ranks countries based on their perceived levels of public level corruption. Sweden's tied for number 4 out of all countries, proving its trustworthiness on a global scale. Now we want to touch on Sweden's imports and exports. We thought it was really interesting that their exports and their imports are both fairly similar. So their cars are their main export at 11.1 billion US dollars, and that was last year's data. Packaged medicaments turned out to be 9.29 billion US dollars, and refined petroleum turned out to be 5.25 billion US dollars. So those are the 3 biggest exports. And with their imports, it was fairly similar, with cars being number 1 at 8.46 billion US dollars, crude petroleum at 5.25 billion US dollars, and motor vehicle parts and accessories imports totaled 4.86 billion US dollars. Now I'll pass it over to TJ to talk a little bit more about companies in Sweden.
All right, thanks, Nick. I'm going to be talking about some of the companies that we tracked over the past few months, as well as the largest companies in the country. So starting off with Calliditas, which is a commercial biopharmaceutical company focused on identifying, developing, and commercializing novel treatments in orphan indications, with an initial focus on renal and haptic diseases with significant unmet medical needs. They were created in 2004 and went public in 2018 when they changed their name from PharmaLink. The revenue from this past year was just over 260 million and is currently trading at $17.21. Now, moving on to Ericsson, which was created in 1879 and is one of the leading providers of information and communication technology to service providers. They enable the full value of connectivity by creating game-changing technology and services that are easy to use, adopt, and scale, making their customers successful in a fully connected world. They recorded revenue up until September just over $68 billion and is trading at $6.32. Lastly, Oatly was created in 1994 after founders and brothers Rickard and Bjorn Oste, who wanted to create a solution for people who were lactose intolerant, ultimately creating oat milk. Oatly strives to deliver products that have maximum nutritional value and minimal environmental impact. The revenue amounts to just over 138 million and is trading at $1.60. Now, the 3 largest companies, according to Forbes Global 2000, are Volvo, Investor, and Ericsson. Now I'll pass it over to Jack to take a look at the market review.
Thanks, TJ. So this has been a really interesting time in Swedish Parliament, and the market has been highly volatile as a result of the changes that have been happening. So starting with the market index that we've been tracking throughout the semester, that's OMX Stockholm, which is comprised of 30 stocks with the highest trading volume on the Stockholm Exchange. Currently, year to date, that index is actually down 12.52%. As I mentioned, the changes that we've been observing are both overall systematic market conditions as well as domestic political conditions that Sweden has been going through. So on the political side of things, Sweden is traditionally a very leftist parliament and has a very socialist governmental structure. However, in August, a moderate party, which is far more conservative than their existing policies, actually took power within the country. As a result, we're seeing some changes towards a more capitalistic approach and a more in line views with the majority of the European Union, as well as other nationwide organizations such as NATO. Furthermore, the country has been facing some of the highest inflation rates to date. The high inflation rate is in some part caused by the strong domestic demand, however, mainly due to events abroad. The pandemic-related lockdown measures in countries such as China ultimately have disrupted global supply chains and increased prices around the world. Touching briefly on Sweden's response to the pandemic, which is also related to their volatility as of late. Sweden was one of the more loose policy enforcers when it came to the pandemic review or responses. So as many of their European counterparts enforced a lockdown, Sweden kept many of their businesses' doors opened and tried to continue with business as usual while the pandemic was going on. Well, after the pandemic started to lift, Sweden experienced a quicker rebound to pre-pandemic business levels. However, now with the majority of other European countries experiencing an economic slowdown, Sweden has been struggling with several different factors. First of all, the result of inflation has caused commodities and materials to rise significantly in their prices, creating rising interest rates and falling housing prices. As I mentioned, Sweden tried to rebound from the pandemic quicker than a lot of other countries. And as a result, they decided to start many new building projects across the country. While that was exciting while it was going on, because of the price increases that I've mentioned, it is expected that many of these building projects will ultimately lose value rather quickly, and their financial outlook going into 2023 is rather bleak. We can expect, or it is expected that their housing market will drop around 8.5% as the company comes out of this pandemic rebound and kind of gets more in line with the overlying financial markets of the European and ultimately the world at large. And with that, I'll pass it to Tyler to talk about geopolitical issues.
You gotta mute yours. Thanks, Jack. So one of the biggest things that's been affecting Sweden and all of Europe, honestly, has been Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Because when Russia made their initial invasion, it really sent shockwaves throughout all of Europe. One of the biggest things that has spiraled out of that is because shortly after Russia launched its unprovoked attack on Ukraine, Sweden and Finland both began to move to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO for short. Most member countries of NATO have quickly approved Sweden joining, though Turkey has been a persistent holdout. Turkey has a few conditions that they want to be met before Turkey will approve their membership to join. Their main condition is that both Sweden and Finland must clamp down on what Turkey refers to as Kurdish terrorist activity within the two Nordic countries, and that both countries drop their restrictions on arms sales to Ankara. Other members of NATO say that they think Turkey is merely trying to exploit the situations for its own personal gain by holding up Sweden and Finland joining NATO. The other big ramification of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been the energy crisis that it's creating throughout all of Europe. So one particular point of contention deals with the Nord Stream gas pipelines. So in late September, there were a couple of massive explosions near Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2. The explosion was near Swedish waters, and so Sweden quickly got involved with investigating what caused the explosions. After probing for months, the investigation has determined that the explosions were intentionally caused and are thus considered acts of sabotage. While the pipelines were not currently in use at the time of sabotage, their destruction has further disrupted possible energy supply to Europe. This is further exacerbating the energy crisis that has impacted Europe in recent months, and the situation becomes more dire as both Sweden and the rest of Europe head into what will be a freezing winter season. And so, governmentally speaking, one of the big changes that they recently made is they released their new budget for their 2023. And one of the most notable things that we picked out of it was their massive 6.8 billion kroner tax cut on petrol and diesel. We believe that they're making these tax cuts in an effort to increase supply, and then that way they can reduce the cost of energy in Sweden. So in conclusion, Sweden is a country that has a long storied history that is very interesting, but the next couple of years could be very rocky in Sweden as their housing market could be headed towards a bubble that's about to pop, and there's quite possible recession coming in 2023. So thank you.